overall demographic changes that are happening and are going to continue to happen. There are also changes that are occurring right now in terms of the overall expectations of the workforce. Credentials are changing. We're now looking at badges. We're looking at non-degree type of credentials. We're seeing many companies, Amazon being one of them, Google also, looking for credentials that are not necessarily tied to a degree from an accredited institution. And so these non-university credentials are something that are starting to become more and more popular. We're seeing federal dollars for Pell Grants and other federal dollars being able to now go to non-university entities, but still providing some type of credential, but outside of our traditional university setup. So the reality is things are certainly changing. We have budget issues. Every institution has these budget issues. We're seeing state appropriations decrease dramatically. And just this past year, Alaska, as you probably know, had, I think, about a 60% cut in the overall state funding that was going toward the universities. Well, if any institution loses 60% of its funding, that is more than just dramatic, and is increasingly common. And we're seeing these kinds of things happen across the board with all of our institutions. We also have ongoing access issues, making sure that students can access higher education. You know, there has been for quite some time now an expectation that any student who wants to go to college is going to be able to go to college. But the reality is that's not always the case. So we have access issues where students cannot get to an institution, even if they are even if they are very well prepared students. And so how do we deal with some of that access issues? How do we deal with issues related to student debt? And that may not always be within our own ability to change, but certainly it's something that's impacting higher education as a whole. And so these all of these issues and several that are related to that are things that we are starting to see, and they're going to impact us more and more. We're going to see at institutions like FIU, we're going to start seeing more. Okay, leave a moment. Okay, great. Yeah, please put your questions in the chat box, and we'll certainly respond to them as much as possible. But we're going to see larger class sizes. We're going to see, you know, all of these different kinds of impacts on us that we will have relatively little control over. So all of that is certainly ongoing and problematic, and something that we need to be aware of happening so that we can find ways where we can better respond rather than just simply reacting to some of these problems.
So one question from Rachel is, as one of the largest Hispanic serving institutions in the U.S., is FIU seeing a reduction in non-Hispanic students, and if so, how does that impact us?
The demographics of FIU are not changing rapidly. What we do know is that students that are white males tend to have one of the highest dropout rates, and that does impact us. But I think that that's not just us. I think a lot of males in general across higher education are dropping out of higher education. This is a trend that will greatly change the way that we consider the traditional breadwinner in the future. So now more women are achieving higher levels of education. There's still disparities in terms of how much money they receive for equal labor. But that's certainly something that has been one of the changes in the landscape of higher education.
And we're seeing, definitely those gender differences,
Mm-hmm.
and we're seeing more and more females apply and be accepted, and then they're retained at higher rates.
Yes.
And so it is certainly changing much of how we approach and how we look at our programs. So there's all kinds of things changing. We're also seeing changes in accreditation, and those are going to impact us in a variety of ways. Just recently, there has been a change in the geographic determination as to which accrediting body you should be under based on where you were physically located. And that seems to now be changing, and that's going to impact a lot of things. With the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act, we're probably going to see some other changes. So there's all kinds of things that are happening. We clearly touched on this in the last session just a little bit, that we have these newer definitions of student success, with metrics being decided on by people often outside of higher education. And so we are having to comply with some of those. And so as we look at these calls for accountability and performance-based funding, certainly, and completion rates, we are living in a different world than higher education was in 25 years ago. And so as we see some of these changes happening and the funding decreasing and having to look at new revenue streams to make up some of that funding, it changes how we program and how we focus on these things. And these are realities that we are going to have to address. And so, one of the questions that comes up is, well, why even bother? If it's going to be that way, it's just going to be that way. So why even bother with all of that? And I think there are important things to think about why we even want to bother. And as we've talked before, if you were in the morning session or the most recent afternoon session, we talked a lot about accountability and or improvement, and the fact that it really is, we want to do things for improvement, but we also recognize that we are going to have to do things for accountability as well. And if we can structure a setup in the way we kind of want to, where we can do things for improvement, but then also use those same things for accountability, well, then we can kind of straddle that pretty well. There are some things, however, that are going to be for compliance and accountability, and it's going to be hard to see how those impact improvement. And that puts institutions sometimes in a difficult space where they're having to show compliance with something that may or may not actually kind of be helpful in some of that. So that's kind of a place where we are. And so when we kind of look back at some of the overall policy changes that have happened, that have impacted higher ed, early on we had public examinations and theses defenses that were done, in public, and that was how we were able to demonstrate learning. But it was done with a much smaller number of students than we have now. And that obviously is not something that would scale well at all. Benjamin Bloom in 1968 started discussing and publishing quite a bit on this idea of mastery learning, with the idea that it wasn't as much about how much a student learns, and that we would then give a grade based on they learned a little bit versus they learned a lot, which might be, a little bit might be a D or whatever, whereas a lot might be an A. But that with mastery learning, the idea was that everyone can achieve that mastery level. And so Bloom talked about the idea that instead of holding time constant and the learning varies like we do in a typical semester, every student is taking the class for that semester. At the end, they get the grade that they've earned. Instead of doing that, what if we were to hold the learning constant and let the time be more variable? So if a student came in and took a class and they already had some of the knowledge, or they were able to learn much more quickly, or they were doing fewer things outside of taking the class, they might finish faster. And so they might get that class done as long as they hit that mastery level, whereas some students, it might take them longer. So that doesn't fit as well into our semester structure, and so that becomes more complicated. But the concept of mastery learning, that every student can learn and every student should learn to a particular level in a particular area, is a really interesting one that I think we need to kind of keep in mind as we look at writing learning outcomes and looking at assessment plans across the board, that there are certain levels of learning that we should expect, and that we should work till we get to those levels. In the 70s, Sandy Aston wrote a book, 4 Critical Years, and his colleague wrote The Academic and Social Integration. And so this idea of a value-added education, that students come to higher education for added value, that it does something for them. It helps them move from one point to another point. And I think that becomes a really important piece as we think about the changes in policy and how we look at higher education. In '83, some of you might remember when A Nation at Risk came out, and because of that, we started getting legislative calls for change in higher education, where the belief that we were not providing what we said we were providing, and higher education was not meeting its goals and its what it was supposed to do. And so at that point, we started getting, and I'll call it interference, and that might be totally accurate, but we started getting more attention, certainly, from the federal government, from the state government, about the amount of funding that they were putting into higher education. And so when we look at some of the other kinds of pieces, accrediting bodies started requiring assessment in the late 80s, early 90s. We got new ideas from the corporate world, total quality management and CQI and all these other kinds of approaches, which can be very helpful in thinking about assessment, but had some people kind of thinking that higher education is like a business, or like a corporation, and that has certainly changed how people outside of higher ed have thought about higher ed. More recently, we're certainly seeing a push for rankings, and every administration wants to move up in the rankings wherever they are, unless they're Harvard, Yale, or Stanford, in which case they are pretty much always up there. But we are seeing more and more of that. We're seeing expectations for employment following completion, and the idea that many families and parents and students come to a university not because they want to learn more, but because they want to get a job and they want to be employed, and they want to have the kinds of things that they think will come with the credential of a university degree. And so suddenly higher education, and maybe this isn't suddenly, but more recently, higher education has moved from this value added kind of, we are for the common good, and we are doing these things and improving and enhancing our students, to job training and expectations about this kind of employment. Along these same time, we're seeing increases in standardized testing. We're seeing the performance-based funding that we've talked a little bit about, and so much of this is going to these relatively superficial kinds of data collection and rankings that certainly have a place, but we're losing out on this concept of learning, and that does not seem to be forefront in a lot of these ideas that we're seeing. We also have the Higher Ed Reauthorization Act, and it is reauthorized every 4 to 6 years. And of course, the last time was in 2008. And if you do the math, you realize that we're a little late on that reauthorization. And there are conversations right now happening in the legislature, in the federal legislature, trying to push through the next reauthorization of that. And we'll see what happens if it actually gets through this year. There are some expectations of what will be changed in that. And a lot of that does have to do with accreditation and funding at the federal level of students who are wanting to attend higher education. And so we're seeing that in just a lot of different ways. So that is going to certainly have an impact on us. There will be aspects of that in terms of affordability that may limit what institutions, especially public institutions, can charge. And as public institutions are seeing some limits on tuition dollars, you are also seeing decreases in state appropriation funding. And so it means there's less money going around. And so what many institutions are doing is they're looking for these alternative revenue streams. And looking at some of those, which changes often how we do what we do and what our strategic goals are. So all of these things are happening along with the access issues that I mentioned before, looking at our retention and graduation rates, and the overall time to completion, accreditation standards, which change somewhat and may change a great deal after this reauthorization. But what we don't see in much of the Higher Ed Act is a lot about learning. And what are students learning? What are we expected to teach? What are students supposed to do from that perspective? And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Part of me thinks it's a bad thing because we really should be talking about learning when we're talking about higher education. The other part thinks that maybe it's not such a bad thing and maybe a very good thing, because we really don't want the federal government to legislate the learning that needs to happen, I think. So we've got that that's happening. We also have so many naysayers. We talked a little bit about this in the last session, where people have said assessment's a waste of time, it's a symptom of higher education's crisis, surveys can't tell you anything, and if we can't do assessment in rigorous enough ways, so we just shouldn't do it at all. And then the quote that I mentioned last time, that the dysfunctionality of assessment starts with the primacy of evidence and data, which just continues to floor me every time. I've been reading that now for 3 years, and it just continues to just shock me. And so we are in a place that is incredibly problematic. Now I've got several slides in here that were in the previous session, because I wasn't 100% sure that the same people would be coming to the session both times. So I'm not going to really talk about these as we look at the assessment as it's often done for accountability, and look at it instead as that assessment for transformation, because that's really where we want to be focusing on, is that assessment is something that is useful and that does truly align with everything that we do and how we focus on everything. So given where we are in higher education and where things are probably going to be moving in higher education, we can't lose sense of our goals and what we want to be done, regardless of the data and the compliance that we need to provide to our states, to our coordinating boards, to our accreditors, to all of the different entities. We still need to be maintaining this idea of that we're assessing for learning. We're assessing because learning matters. We know best the areas where students need to grow and learn. And as we partner with our students, looking at what they need and where they're going and where our fields are changing, we still need to be focused on that piece so that we can continue to improve what we're doing. The example I gave in the last session about my daughter having a fever and actually taking data and using it to give her something to help decrease her fever comes from a quote from Ted Marquesi, and he said, "Assessment per se guarantees nothing by way of improvement, no more than that a thermometer cures a fever." And so that assessment, if we don't use it and we don't use our data and we don't look at it as a transformational process, then we're just collecting things. When I first started working in the assessment field, I was at Stevens College, a small private women's college in Missouri, and we collected portfolios from students. And at that time, they were not digital, they were actual paper portfolios, and we would collect them, and then we would take them upstairs and put them in a fourth floor office that wasn't being used, and then to look at them later. Well, later never actually got there, and so the next year we would get them and take them and put them, and one year they fell over. And there was no way, so we ended up taking all of that work that students had done and we never actually used it. And now, did the students learn something by putting it together? Yes, I believe that they did. But we did not use that in the way that we should have. And so I think if we're not using our assessment data, then we're really not doing what we should be doing as educators. And that becomes an important piece. So assessment truly is part of the teaching and learning landscape. It is built into teaching and learning. It is not something that is just separate from that. So what we get is this idea that learning is a process, as I've mentioned several times. It's not a static phenomenon. It's not something that once you've learned, you're done. It is this ongoing process. We want to build on it. We want to see where it is. We want to keep working with that. And because learning is this process and we can't actually see it, so we're actually making an inference because we can't see learning happen. It's something that happens inside the mind and the brain. But what we can observe is the performance or behavior that results from that learning. And so we infer learning by observing a measurable performance. And so that's why we have to focus on a learning outcome and a measurable learning outcome, because that's really what we can see. But because of the fact that we're dealing with something that is complex and messy, we actually need to have multiple methods to make sure that what we know, that what we're seeing is valid, that it is the truth. And we've all had situations where we were collecting assessment data and we sampled and we got some student responses, but we were never quite confident that that was accurate because of the particular sample size of the students. Well, and if we're doing that, then we need multiple methods to make sure that what we are finding is accurate. Because if not, then we have a problem, because we're basing our decision making on information that we're getting from data that aren't valid, and that means we aren't really helping ourselves any with that. So we really have to think about assessment as this ongoing process that is truly a search for truth, and a search for understanding, and that is a process that continues, and that we have to look at it really, really carefully. So one of the things that I mentioned this in the morning session is this idea of the ideal student. And if you have this ideal student and you meet them, 5 years after they completed, what do they say? What do they know? What do they do? How do they act? What do they believe? All of these kinds of questions can be asked. And so if you think about this and kind of develop a list of what this would be, these become your implicit learning goals. And a question then to ask yourself is, okay, these are my implicit learning goals. Are they explicit to students? Are they explicit to students in my course? What about the overall program? If all of the faculty in your program did this and came up with a list, and they would probably have quite a bit of overlap, about what truly is important for students to say, know, do, act, and believe, then those should be reflected in the assessment process that you that you do. And that is something to look at and think about whether or not that actually is in place, and is an opportunity for us to reflect on our own assessment processes, and learn from that. And so I think this can be a very valuable kind of exercise to do individually as you're looking at your courses that you teach, and with your other faculty looking at your program as a whole. With all of this. So what kind of learning do we expect? And how do we determine that? Certainly, we all come from different disciplines, and we have learning expectations that are very disciplinary specific. Some of us have external specialized accrediting bodies that tell us, here's the list of the learning that we expect to have. But in addition to that, and for those programs that don't have it, we can look at questions of what do employers want from our students? And when they get our students, do they get what they want? Do we know? Are we asking employers about that? What about our alums? What do our alums say that they wish they had learned? And are we using that to feed back into our overall expectations for students? So what do our alumni say they learned really well? What do they say they wish they had learned? Because that can be incredibly helpful to think about the list of learning outcomes that you have for your program. And then certainly looking at how the disciplinary field is changing. What are the new methodologies? What's the new findings? Are there new theories? How does that look? And how does that now need to change how you are looking at what you are expecting and assessing in terms of student learning? I know we had a conversation, I think it was at lunch, about how the IT field is changing on a regular basis. And so, we would certainly not expect an IT department to be having the same assessment plan that they had 10 years ago, because it looks very different now. Well, what about some of our other fields? Some of them also look very different, some not as much. But I think that these are a lot of the questions that we need to be regularly asking ourselves as we reflect on changing higher education, our changing student body, and our changing fields. And that really should impact our assessment and our assessment of learning with what students are doing. So some best practices and some things to kind of share to see what we can develop. I've already mentioned e-portfolios and reflective portfolios as being a really wonderful tool to be able to look across students relatively in a very defined way. These reflective portfolios can be used by students also as they look at internships or potential employment. because they're able to show more than just a resume. As somebody mentioned in the last session, that these portfolios can truly be a very useful learning tool and an assessment tool. We also have integrated data sets. We have so many data sets on every single one of our campuses that we cannot look at everything. We cannot assess everything. But if we could at least look at some of them and develop some of them in ways that they provide us information about our students in ways that we don't have to necessarily search for that, then that can become really, really useful. So if you can get the alumni survey for your students and you know what your your alums are saying, well, that can be really incredibly helpful. FIU does several other surveys, and looking at those data and looking at how that impacts your program and what that may tell you about your students, again, provides you with some great information so that we are using more of the information that we have. I think that another best practice is sharing the learning goals with your students and with the community. The same way we do in our courses, on the syllabus, we state often the learning outcomes for the course. In this course, you're going to do this, this, and this, and you're going to learn these kinds of things. And we should be doing that at the program level as well. And when students know what they're supposed to learn, it can help them to see kind of how the program is developed and how those program pieces in their individual courses fit into that big picture. And I know you all are doing curriculum maps, and I think that curriculum map is really a very useful way of looking at the learning goals that you all have, and that this way your students know what they're supposed to learn. So I think that we also have to be working on identifying success in ways that really matter. Certainly retention is important. Graduation rates are absolutely important. But there are other ways that we can look at what being successful, what a successful student looks like. And I think that we have to sometimes be innovative, and we have to find ways to do that, and then we have to share what we're doing so that information is provided outside our own areas. We need to be looking more across disciplinary areas to find out what students really know and what they really need. There are wonderful opportunities to work with entities across our universities, in student affairs, in some of the service learning units, in all kinds of different areas across campus. And we miss that as an opportunity often because we see that as a separate silo from us. And yet the student experience is one that is across the whole university. And so we need to be able to look across that as well as we're thinking through what students really need to know. And when possible, I'm a big fan of automation. If we can pull something in electronically and analyze some of that electronically, then that's even better. And if we can have data roll up or push down into different areas, then we're able to actually see them more quickly and more easily. And some of our technologies are better able to do that. And I think that can continue as we look at things. I know there are things in your course shells that some of that can actually be pulled and rolled up. Some of it's already pushed down. You get your student lists in there, you get those kinds of things in there. Some of that can also be pushed up so that we can have better information across our kind of silos. So good assessment practices. We need to be engaging students in their disciplinary work. We need to be able to involve students across the institution in what they're doing, because students are not only in our majors and in our programs, they're also in student organizations, they're in student government, they're in the marching band or whatever. So students are involved across campus. not just in our disciplines. Now, your disciplinary assessment plans may focus only on those things within your program, but the reality is that as higher ed changes and as we have more and more of a competition often to bring in students to our institutions, we're going to have to come up with ways to look at students differently and not only in our programs. I think we need to set and maintain realistically high and meaningful expectations, and that's those aspirational goals that we talked about in the session before. We need to provide and make use of regular and specific feedback on learning. Students do get feedback on their learning, but we often don't use that for assessment, and sometimes that's very appropriate. But if we are able to provide feedback to students and we're giving the same feedback to a lot of students in a program or a course, well then why don't we think about using some of that at the program level to better provide students information early on so that they can be more successful. All of this is really saying that we want to engage students in their own learning. We want them to certainly be active participants in that they're not just vessels into which we're pouring knowledge. They are constructing the learning process as they go along. And so that becomes this exciting opportunity for us, but it also makes it a little bit more difficult because we now have to look at the assessment process as not just being something that's a static process. And so we have to regularly be looking at all of this. So what works? If we have well understood goals and learning objectives, they need to be recent, they need to be relevant, and they need to be rigorous. And these are things that everyone in the department should understand, students should understand, and if their families understand too, even better. Because that way we're communicating why we're doing what we're doing. I think it's also important to recognize that there are some types of learning, and they've often been called emergent learning, that comes out of our teaching learning process that isn't necessarily predetermined. And these are the kinds of things that happen and that we didn't expect but are really fantastic. And they often don't get added to an assessment program or report that goes into the assessment office or the university as a whole, because the expectation is, well, not every student would always do this, and this was just a really amazing group of students or what have you. But if we can recognize this emergent learning and find a way to build it into the reporting structure, then we can see how that learning is emerging and changing and what that actually looks like. Obviously, we have to have measures that are meaningful, they're reliable, they're valid, and there has to be faculty leadership of this overall process. Faculty are the ones who are doing the vast majority of teaching on campus. Certainly, teaching happens at all levels in student affairs and other kinds of places where there's certainly education going on. But our faculty have the responsibility, and you're the ones who are in the front lines of this educational process. So having leadership in that process is crucial. And this builds then a framework for ongoing discussion and actions of this assessment process, so that it's something that comes up. So sessions like this workshop and the other kinds of ongoing work that the assessment office is doing with faculty are part of this framework that really builds all of this up. And as I mentioned before, assessment really comes from a Latin term which means to sit beside. And so we want to be able to have that ongoing dialogue and process of learning that's a partnership, that isn't just a static report that's submitted. So as we look at assessment, well, why do we assess? We assess because learning is kind of the point of higher education. That's what we do. That's we are learning organizations. Our students are learning. We're all about learning. That's what we do. And what that means is we can actually use assessment as a piece of that learning process. And that means we can look at our assessment plans and our assessment goals and our assessment processes in ways that are open to change and are open to dialogue, and that allow for a lot of those kinds of pieces, because assessment gives us that overall framework that regardless of what happens in the changing landscape in higher education, regardless of the funding difficulties that we are going to encounter, our focus is still on learning and educating our students in the areas that they need. And that becomes our point. So regardless of these changes, we have the ability and the responsibility to really focus on student learning and improving and enhancing student learning. So at that point, we've got a couple minutes still, and I wanted to see what sorts of questions some of you may have had. So let's see.
That's just what they're talking about in the chat.
Yeah.
Beginning about Pell.
Okay, and so let's see. So more than half of students are on Pell Grants, and has that been relatively stable across?
It's actually 37. It's a new
areas I didn't read far enough.
37.
Yeah.
We're in
37%,
and now it's dropped to 33.
Okay.
But maybe they're not actually applying for it.
Mm-hmm. So,
or changes, or as like Arlene said, changes in the admission criteria, changes the number of students who qualify.
mm-hmm. And so there are a lot of these external changes that are going to impact our students and our student population, and we again have to work to certainly respond to those changes. And the more that we know about what might be changing, the better we can work to not just respond or not just react, but we can respond meaningfully, and we can actually plan ahead in some of these instances, so that we can still continue to provide what we need to provide for our students.
And John Bushman asked if other colleges or schools also had a high percentage of students working full-time. And yes, we do, and it's going to only increase, especially as the non-traditional student becomes more common. And that's changing across the nation, but especially for commuter schools such as ours. And it's definitely a thing for everyone.
And not only are we going to see more and more students working, but we're going to see students moving back and forth from full-time to part-time, back to full-time as they're able to do that. We're also going to see students moving across institutions, and kind of that swirling of going to multiple institutions. And so we're going to have to think about how that impacts us individually as institutions, and how we can better work together to make sure that in general our students, regardless of whether they end with us or start with us, that they're able to have some success. And I look at the time, and we are out of time, but I just want to thank all of you for taking your time to be with us all today. I think this has been a wonderful start to some dialogue, and a continuation of some of the dialogue that has been going on here for a while, and I very much appreciate being part of it. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful rest of Friday the 13th.
Thank you, Catherine.